Let's slow this down, because the way most American outlets have framed this story buries the actual story beneath it. On the surface, what happened between the United States and Canada over the past several months looks familiar. Tariff threats, retaliatory measures, diplomatic friction. The usual theater of trade confrontation that the Trump era has made almost routine. If you caught it in passing, you probably filed it under another chapter in the ongoing trade wars and moved on. That would be a mistake. Because if you look past the headlines and examine what actually unfolded, what Mark Carney quietly did while Washington was busy congratulating itself on applying pressure, you find something far more consequential than a bilateral spat over tariffs. You find a story about how energy leverage actually operates in the real world, about what happens when a powerful country mistakes its neighbor's patience for dependence, and about the kind of leadership that reshapes geopolitical reality without ever raising its voice. This is that story. The foundation Washington took for granted. To understand why what Carney built matters so much, you have to first understand the depth of what already existed and how thoroughly Washington misread it. The energy relationship between the United States and Canada is not a trade relationship in any ordinary sense. It is a structural integration so deep, so physically embedded, so woven into the operational reality of American industry and American households that calling it a trade relationship is almost misleading. Start with oil. Canada supplies more crude to the United States than any other country on Earth, more consistently than the entire Persian Gulf combined. But here is the part that rarely gets mentioned. The refineries that process Canadian crude, primarily across the Midwest and Gulf Coast, were engineered specifically for it. The heavy bitumen that flows from Alberta's oil sands requires a particular refinery configuration. You cannot swap in a different crude grade without months of operational disruption and capital expenditure running into the hundreds of millions. This is not a preference. It is a physical constraint built into American industrial infrastructure. Then consider electricity. Canadian hydroelectric power, particularly from Quebec, is not a supplemental supply for American utilities in New England and the upper Midwest. It is load-bearing power. It is built into grid reliability calculations. During peak winter demand, it is not optional. American grid planners have incorporated it as a core resource, not a backup. Add natural gas flowing in multiple directions across pipelines that serve residential heating, industrial processes, and power generation in states across the northern tier. The integration is total. It is the product of decades of investment, planning, and cooperation built on a single foundational assumption so obvious that nobody ever examined it explicitly. The assumption was this: the two governments would always behave like partners. The Trump administration decided to test that assumption, and it turns out testing it had consequences nobody in Washington had fully modeled. The misreading that started everything. The logic inside the administration was straightforward. Canada sells enormous volumes of energy into the American market. That dependency, the reasoning went, is a vulnerability. Apply enough economic pressure and Ottawa will eventually accommodate whatever Washington demands. Classic leverage analysis. It was wrong. Completely, consequentially wrong. And it was wrong for two reasons that the administration either did not consider or did not take seriously. The first reason, interdependence does not only flow in one direction. Yes, Canada relies on American market access, but the United States relies on Canadian supply. Supply embedded in physical infrastructure that cannot be replaced quickly, cheaply, or cleanly. The leverage was never a one-way street. It was always bilateral. And the moment Canada began to manage its side of that leverage with deliberate strategic intent, the power asymmetry Washington assumed it held started to dissolve. The second reason, Mark Carney. This is a man who spent years guiding the Bank of England through the most complex economic transition modern Britain had faced. He knows how financial systems work under stress. He knows how interdependence creates options for patient actors. He knows how a crisis, properly read, can be converted into strategic opportunity. And from the moment Washington started applying pressure, Carney was not thinking about how to survive it. He was thinking about how to use it. The opening that appeared, the global energy landscape in 2025, was defined by anxiety. Europe had spent 2 years scrambling to replace Russian gas after the invasion of Ukraine. American LNG had partially filled that gap, and for a period, it looked as though Washington might anchor European energy security for a generation. But the return of the Trump administration introduced something that European energy buyers find intolerable in a long-term supplier: unpredictability. Export approvals shifted. Regulatory signals changed without warning. The general atmosphere of confrontation that characterized Washington's approach to its international partners made deep energy dependence on the United States feel less like security and more like exchanging one unreliable supplier for another. Europe was looking for an alternative. And across the Pacific, a parallel anxiety was driving similar conclusions. Japan, South Korea, and Australia all needed secure, non-Chinese supply chains for the critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, that their clean energy industries required. China dominated those supply chains. They needed a credible democratic alternative. Canada, sitting on vast reserves of precisely those minerals, governed by rule of law, committed to environmental standards that European and Asian partners cared about, led by a figure with deep credibility in global financial and policy circles, was the obvious answer to both anxieties. Obvious, though, does not mean automatic. Obvious means available, if the right leadership moves fast enough to activate it. Carney moved. What he actually built. The EU track accelerated first. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union had existed since 2017, but had never been fully operationalized as a strategic tool. Carney's government moved to change that, opening substantive, technically grounded negotiations on Canadian LNG supply to European markets, Canadian critical mineral exports to European clean energy manufacturers, and the longer-term prospect of Canadian clean electricity as a complement to European renewable grids. These were not aspirational conversations. They were commercial negotiations conducted with urgency by people who understood the window was real and finite. The Pacific Track ran in parallel. A series of critical mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia represented the most significant expansion of Canadian engagement across the Pacific in a generation. The strategic logic was identical across all three. Canada's resource wealth plus Canada's governance credibility equaled the ideal non-Chinese source for the materials underpinning democratic Asia's clean energy transition. Every supply agreement signed with a Pacific partner was a supply agreement that did not run through Beijing. Every long-term contract embedded Canadian resources in non-American, non-Chinese supply chains that will persist for decades. The United Kingdom dimension, less discussed but equally significant, followed from a different logic. Britain and Canada share deep institutional bonds, common law, Commonwealth ties, financial sector integration, decades of defense and intelligence cooperation, with Britain still navigating post-Brexit trade complexity and its American negotiations stalled. The opportunity for a comprehensive Canada-UK economic partnership was genuinely available. Carney took it. The result was the deepest expansion of the Canada-UK economic relationship since before Britain joined the European community. Why this cannot be undone. Here is the point I want to make sure lands clearly, because I do not think it has been fully absorbed in Washington yet. What Carney built is not a negotiating position. It is not a temporary diplomatic alignment that reverses when the political temperature drops. It is a physical, legal, and commercial reality that will exist regardless of who holds office on either side of any border. Energy infrastructure operates on multi-decade timeframes. When an LNG export terminal on Canada's Pacific coast is operating and serving Asian customers, it is serving Asian customers. When a European country builds an import facility configured to receive Canadian LNG, that country has made a 20-year capital commitment to the Canada-Europe energy relationship. When a Japanese battery manufacturer signs a 15-year critical mineral contract with a Canadian mining company, that supply chain is Canadian for 15 years. None of those facts can be reversed by a change of administration. None of them respond to diplomatic pressure or tariff threats. They are embedded in concrete and steel and legally binding contracts. And every one of them represents a portion of the global energy market that the United States can no longer assume it controls or has privileged access to. This is what actually changed, not the diplomatic temperature, not the public rhetoric, the underlying structure of how Canadian energy resources connect to the world. The United States held for decades a kind of implicit monopoly over Canadian strategic resources, not a formal one, but a practical one, rooted in geography and the assumption that Ottawa had nowhere else to turn. That monopoly no longer exists. Canada has real partners. Canada has real alternatives. And that means the bilateral energy relationship going forward requires something it never formally required before: genuine reciprocity. Who pays for this? I want to pause here and say something that gets lost when these stories get told at the level of geopolitics and diplomacy. The people who make confrontational trade and foreign policy decisions are, almost without exception, insulated from the consequences of those decisions. The tariffs do not hit their household budgets. The supply chain disruptions do not threaten their employment. The energy reliability questions do not affect their heating bills. But the workers in Midwestern refinery towns whose plants depend on Canadian crude, they are not insulated. The homeowners in New England whose winter heating costs reflect the reliability of cross-border electricity supply, they are not insulated. The auto workers whose jobs depend on an integrated North American supply chain that cross-border disruption puts at risk, they are not insulated. They absorb the consequences directly. They cannot hedge against them or diversify away from them. And the specific costs being generated by this confrontation, higher risk premiums on cross-border energy, planning uncertainty at American utilities, competitive losses in global energy markets to a Canada that is now better positioned than it was, these costs are not being distributed to the decision-makers who created them. They are flowing down supply chains to communities the policy debate rarely notices until the damage is done. This is not a secondary concern. It is the central moral reality of the story. The three consequences Washington is now living with. The first consequence is energy security. Every American institution that depends on the cross-border energy system, utilities, refiners, industrial users, is now operating inside a political risk that did not previously exist. That risk does not have to materialize into a full supply crisis to be costly. It shows up in planning conservatism, in risk premiums, in the capital cost of developing alternative supply as a hedge. Those costs are real, and they will be paid by ratepayers and businesses and communities at the end of supply chains. The second consequence is competitive. Canadian LNG flowing to Europe is a market American exporters did not capture. Critical minerals flowing to Japanese manufacturers under long-term Canadian contracts are resources American firms were not positioned to supply. These are genuine competitive losses with genuine economic consequences for American energy companies and the workers who depend on them. The third consequence is structural and the most important of the three. American strategic influence has historically rested on being the indispensable partner, the country at the center of every critical relationship, the country that everyone depended on and therefore everyone accommodated. When you treat even your closest, most integrated partner as a target for economic coercion, you do not just damage that one bilateral relationship. You send a signal to every country watching. You tell them that American partnership is conditional in ways it was not previously understood to be. That signal spreads, and as it spreads, it becomes self-reinforcing. Countries that hedge against American unpredictability create a world in which American centrality is less automatic. Less automatic centrality means less leverage. Less leverage means less capacity to shape outcomes. Less capacity to shape outcomes means less security for American citizens who depend on a stable, institutionally ordered world. Structural weakening compounds. The lesson that should not need to be said. History does not usually deliver clean lessons. This one is unusually direct. Carney's response to the crisis Washington created was patient, methodical, and rooted in genuine competence about how global energy systems and international institutions actually function. The result, a more strategically embedded Canada, a more diversified Canadian energy sector, a more multipolar global energy landscape, will outlast the immediate confrontation by decades. The recklessness that triggered that response produced costs in American competitive position, in bilateral trust, in the reliability of energy systems American households and businesses depend on, that will also compound for decades. None of this was inevitable. None of it was required by geography or economics or the structural logic of great power competition. It was produced by specific choices made by specific people who did not take seriously the cost of what they were doing. The lesson is not that any individual was uniquely clever or uniquely reckless. The lesson is that competence and respect, applied consistently over time, build things that last. And that contempt, applied casually to relationships that took decades to build, destroys things that are very hard to rebuild. Canada built a world that does not depend on American goodwill to function. Washington is now learning what it means to live in it.